Alright guys, let's talk about a topic that is really important in the Node.js community, and that's asynchronous and synchronous processes. Now, take a look at this picture. PHP is an example of a normal back-end programming language. Node.js is the new one which we're talking about right now. So the way code is executed in PHP is a task is submitted. For example, let's say the user wanted to see the about page. So that task is submitted, and then the first thing PHP does is understand the request or perform specific tasks. Let's say uploads a file and then saves a record into the database and then makes another API request to another server, but it has a lot of tasks before it actually is done and then sends a response to the browser, right? So the way PHP does it is it performs tasks synchronously, which means one task has to complete before the next task is done, and then that task completes before the next task is done. Alright, so that's how PHP does it. But Node.js gives the possibility of performing tasks asynchronously, right? So look at what happens when a request is made to a Node.js server. Automatically, Node.js executes those tasks in parallel, which means asynchronously. So rather than waiting for one task to complete before executing the other, just like in PHP, Node.js executes all of those tasks at exactly the same time, which means that no task is blocking the other, which brings us to a term called blocking and non-blocking code. Okay, so for us to understand more of this, I'm going to go to the example we have right now and make you understand. So in the index.js file, the first thing we did was import these two, and then we actually used the read file sync function to read these files from these HTML files, and then we went ahead to create our server and then respond to the specific request that the user is making, right? Now, notice that we used a read file sync function, and any function that you see in Node.js that ends with sync means that it is synchronous, which means that it's going to block the execution of the code. Remember, if it's synchronous, that task must complete before it goes to the next task. And if it's asynchronous, that task is going to be executed and other tasks are also going to be executed while that task is still executing, right? So in this case, we used a function that has sync at the end, which means that this line of code would not be executed until this one is done, and this one would not be executed until this one is also done, which means the code is synchronous. Okay, now for the asynchronous version, this is going to have a function called read file, no sync at the end. So if we put read file right now, and also we're going to put read file right here, you're going to see that if we execute this file right now, Node is going to give us a warning. So I'm just going to say node index.js, and look at that. We have three warnings. We have calling an asynchronous function without callback is deprecated, and it does that 3 times because we are calling 3 asynchronous functions right here. Now, what does Node.js mean by that? Node.js is going to be executing this asynchronously, which means it's going to start this line of code, and while this read file function is still reading this file, it's going to start this line of code also. So this is not yet done doing what it's supposed to do, but this has already started, and this one is also going to start, and Node.js is also going to go to this one. Okay, so look at what happens. Node.js starts all of those tasks at exactly the same time, and then once everything is done, it can now respond to the server. But Node.js gives us a warning because what happens when those tasks are completed? We need to tell Node.js what to do. Okay, so what we are going to tell Node.js to do is execute a function. So the second parameter into all asynchronous functions is a function. Okay, and most of the time, for example, the function receives the results of the asynchronous process. For example, this read file process is going to give us the file that has been read. Okay, so after Node.js completely reads this file, it's going to call this function while passing in the file that was read right here. Okay, so now that we've passed in a function as a second parameter into this read file function, if we stop our server and start it again, you can see that we have 2 error messages right now, which is for this process and this one. So Node.js expects that we pass in a function which is going to be executed after the asynchronous process is completed. Okay, now why do we start by using synchronous functions? Because we don't want the server to respond when the page has not yet been read. Okay, because remember, these are tasky processes on the server, and the server is going to take a few milliseconds more to read these files. So that's why Node.js presents us with the option of using asynchronous processes. Okay, so Node is going to execute our code, but it's not going to wait for one line to execute before it goes to the next line, which means that Node gives us the possibility of writing non-blocking code. Okay, so this line is not a blocker to this one, and this one is not a blocker to this one. But in this case, this is synchronous, which means they are blockers to each other, which means till the about page is done reading, it's not going to read the contact page. Until the contact page is done reading, it's not going to read the home page. So this is blocking code. But if you want to use the asynchronous version, you are going to have to write non-blocking code. Okay, which is awesome, but we are going to see exactly how this is advantageous in future. But for now, we're just going to leave it synchronous so that we know that before it executes this line of code, all the pages have already been fetched or read from these HTML files. Alright guys, so that's your basic introduction to synchronous and asynchronous code in Node.js. I'll catch you on in the very next lesson.